My name's Sam. I'm an associate professor at Edinburgh Napier University, and my work and practice involve using poetry and games and other creative pedagogies as a way to explore staff and student belonging. As we all do, and I guess a varied academic background. My first degree was physics, my PhD was atmospheric physics. And then now my research also involves using poetry to help platform the voices of diverse and marginalized communities. So obviously quite a linear transgression from physics through to the use of poetry in social science. And I guess for the past decade or so, what I've really been doing is using, with Jenny actually and others, poetry as a method and really thinking about how we can use poetry to reflect and learn in higher education and beyond. And it was really great seeing the MYFest and Equity Unbound, I guess, guiding principles, because I think a lot of that is true here as well. Everyone's welcome. It's a safe space. There'll be opportunities to write and share poetry, but you don't have to. And I guess the key thing to reflect on throughout all of this is it's not about the aesthetics of the poetry, although I'm sure many of you will create beautiful poetry. It's about the process. And feel free to get in contact with me at any time via my email address, my website, or my Twitter X handle. So basically, there's lots of different ways we can approach poetry, but I think one of the ways I look at it is a raw approach. So we read some poetry, we analyze some poetry, and we write some poetry. And I'm sure some of you will be thinking, oh, I don't really want to analyze poetry, or oh, I don't really want to write poetry. It's a Friday. Is this really what I want to do? But all I ask is that you come to it with an open heart and an open mind, as I'm sure many of you do, because the session is advertised as poetry. Sometimes I have to not put poetry in the title of things to encourage more people to come, but we're a perfectly formed unit today. And I just want to start by reading a poem. And this poem, in a way, acts. I'm not going to offer a comment, but we could use this as an abstract for the whole session. And this poem is called A Position at the University by Lydia Davis. I think I know what sort of person I am, but then I think, but this stranger will imagine me quite otherwise when he or she hears this or that to my credit. For instance, that I have a position at the university. The fact that I have a position at the university will appear to mean that I must be the sort of person who has a position at the university. But then I have to admit with surprise that after all, it is true that I have a position at the university. And if it is true, then perhaps I really am the sort of person you imagine when you hear that a person has a position at the university. But on the other hand, I know I am not the sort of person I imagine when I hear that a person has a position at the university. Then I see what the problem is. When others describe me this way, they appear to describe me completely, whereas in fact they do not describe me completely. And a complete description of me would include truths that seem quite incompatible with the fact that I have a position at the university. And for me personally, when I first read that poem, I just felt incredibly seen, which is why I just like to share it. I'm just leaving it there without any further comment. So we've read a poem, great. I want to go into analysing poetry now. So these three quotes from very learned, very talented, very well remunerated poets, I think highlight some of the issues that we have with poetry in terms of being exclusive and exclusionary. So let's start with Percy Shelley, one of the most important stroke famous romantic poets in Britain. He tells us that poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. Sounds very intelligent, very intelligent. We then move on to Adrienne Rich, fantastic, celebrated American poet. And she tells us that poems are like dreams. In them you put what you don't know you know. and again, it sounds kind of ethereal and intellectual and obviously true. And then Carl Sandburg, another celebrated poet, tells us that poetry is the journal of a sea animal living on land, wanting to fly in the air. At which point I think, this is ridiculous. This is not what poetry is. You're being silly. And I think that it's for many of us, when we encounter poetry, certainly in formal education, we're told that poetry has to mean a certain thing, and that there has to be certain layers of meaning, and that only certain people know what's hidden behind the poetry. And I just don't think that's true at all. So I'd like to offer an alternative way of analysing poetry by a far less successful, celebrated, and certainly remunerated poet, myself. And that is just to say that poetry is whatever it means to you and how it relates to your needs, your experiences, and your understanding. And if you take anything away from this session, it's this. Like, the only person who knows what a poem is written about is the poet. But when the poet wrote that poem, they didn't know you. They didn't know all of the moments of your life that led up to the very second when you were reading that poem. And so what you bring to a poem means that you read it, you bring your whole self, your whole lived experience, your whole life world to it. So when you read the poem, what you take from it is no more or less correct than anybody else. It's just different. And this is not to denigrate critical theorists or English professors. They just bring a different lived experience to the interpretation of the poem. So it's okay to hate poems that people love. It's okay to love poems that people hate. Your experience of a poem might change on a Monday through to a Friday. Certainly poems that I revered in my youth, I don't now, and poems that I did not enjoy in my youth, I love now. So you just bring your whole self to it. So with that in mind, I'd like us to analyze some poetry, but when I say analyze poetry, I just mean I'm going to give you some poems. I want you to read them. I want you to think about if you like them or not and why. So the poems I'd like to share with you, and I'll also copy and paste the link to this in the chat. This is a website that I host called Learned Words, which basically invites people to leave anonymous or otherwise poetry that explores their relationship with higher education. So just going to give people 5 or 6 minutes just to go to this website, randomly scroll through, pick a few poems, 1 or 2, read them, see if you like them, and then we can have a discussion which poems people liked or didn't like and why. And for people that are rewatching this recording, please just do the same, and then feel free to skip forward 5 or 6 minutes when we join the discussion. So I will, I'll also do this as well. I'll just go onto mute, and then you'll see my face just reading poetry. And let's see, let's reconvene at about 20 past the hour. And just see what we say. So I'll give people a 2-3 minute warning, and then just have a read of some poems and see what you think. Okay, and we'll chat again in about 8 minutes time. maybe about 3 more minutes to do this. So if you started reading from the top, maybe go to a poem at the bottom. If you started from the bottom, go to the top or somewhere in the middle. And just have a thought, think about which poems you like and why. There's no more depth needed than that. And then we'll invite open discussion throughout. So about 2 to 3 more minutes. About 1 more minute now, so you might want to start thinking about collecting your thoughts if you want to join the discussion. So about a minute's left. Okay. So I should have said as well, this is obviously a very informal session and there'll be lots of time for interaction. But if anyone's got any comments or questions or anything, just feel free to come off mic on mic or just unmute yourself. And Jenny, thanks for handling the chat as well. So yeah, just interested, were there any poems that particularly resonated with people or that people particularly didn't enjoy? Completely safe space, all opinions very welcome. Feel free to just raise your hand physically or virtually, or put something into the chat as well if you want to. Yeah, Joe.
So one of the things I noticed, let me get the screen. The exercise made me aware how much I like poems where I can kind of find easily the rhythm and the sense of motion. And the one that did that really well for me was Mid-Semester Slump, which I think, I mean, it feels like mid-semester. It feels like everything bearing down. I think that's really well done in that poem. And that's also, I mean, it's the sense of rhythm and motion is also what I really liked about the first one. And then I think one of the things I liked about the exercise is that the second poem, The Journey, didn't resonate for me in the same way. But I think thinking of it as another person's experience of being in the education system drove me to give it maybe a little more respect and spend some time with it, and actually do the work of figuring out what might I respond to in this poem, what can I notice, instead of my more kind of traditional, well, maybe that's not for me, maybe I should go read another one. So I kind of appreciated that angle on somebody else's work.
Thanks, Joe. That's incredibly insightful. And a lot of the work that me and others, including my colleague, Professor Kirsten Jack, have done is actually around exploring the use of poetry for empathy, for the exact reasons that you've said there. That, you know, if we're inviting our students and our colleagues to consider other people's life worlds, experiences, poetry is a really powerful way of doing that, because in a way, you know, every line is considered, and exactly like you said there, even if you don't necessarily appreciate the aesthetics or the rhythm or the meter or anything, it's that, I guess, honesty and, like, in a way, nakedness that appears when people write. So yeah, I totally agree, and I think, you know, I feel as though I feel as though I've planted you there, because it's a beautiful answer that absolutely underpins a lot of my own research and process. And, you know, and Jenny and I have talked about this as well, but I would really invite people to think about, you know, poetry as a way to bring empathy into their classrooms and into their learning environments, either by inviting students to write their own poems, we can talk about that later, or by using poetry from communities that you want to discuss or which you feel as though are not necessarily represented in the classroom as well. So yeah, thanks, Joe. That's a really insightful response. Any other people, anybody else like to comment on any poems that they particularly? Yes, please, Laura, please, and then Jenny.
Okay, it's nothing too dramatic. I started to get depressed looking at some of them actually. Especially, I mean, a lot of them were like, what's the point of all this, being an academic, which I kind of started to have to go past those. Like the 20 years of servitude just made me so sad. But the one that's called Man to Boy, I think it is. Yeah, Man to Boy. I really that one for me is very accessible and very much like a pattern type poem that you could really do as a first like week of class type of poem where, you know, sometimes we have students like write a letter to their future selves, or, you know, write a letter back to themselves when they were young. And it's kind of a way to get to know students. And I thought that was very well done in this verse style, and could be, you know, it's like the I am poems, or, you know,
Absolutely.
where I'm from, you know, but this was very personal. And I think like what Joe brought up, what you mentioned about like a nakedness, um, that I could really, if a student felt like they wanted to really share kind of a core of who they were, that would be a really interesting way to do it. And you could take all the names off of them
Mm.
and share them in the class so people could know that someone in the room feels this way without the name. It's just a
No,
thought.
no, definitely, Laura. And I think, you know, when we're trying to, you know, explore with our students different intersectionalities, you know, there's lots in the research about the need for us to be vulnerable as educators as well. So I think sharing poems like this ourselves, about ourselves, if we
Yeah.
feel comfortable doing so, it can be a really powerful way of showing that vulnerability to create the safe space. But really interestingly, like you said, I mean, there's a very, very interesting debate about the use of trigger warnings with poetry,
Yeah.
because, you know, I know that you said, like, half joking, but I agree, some of these are quite depressing and some of them touch on quite deep subjects actually. So but there's a danger sometimes with me appropriating a trigger warning that hasn't been highlighted by the poet themselves, but that's a discussion for another time, I guess. But it is very important, I think, when sharing poems of maybe a very sensitive nature, to demonstrate to the students that that's there. But certainly, as you said, and then I'll bring Jenny in, one of the things we've done is exactly that, Laura, having and, you know, with our students, anonymized poetry that demonstrates that these are experiences that we're having. You know, be that mental health issues, be that, you know, loneliness, be that positive things as well, like belonging. And I think that with the website, that's what we're trying to do as well, in that even though there's things that are depressing, there's hopefully things that are also there that we can connect with, and there's an element of catharsis, and, you know, we're not alone as well. So yeah, thanks, Laura. They're really,
Thank
really
you.
helpful comments. Jenny.
So first, I just wanted to highlight there's quite a lively discussion in the chat around ones that people feel connected to, a man to boy, some sense of belonging, the foreigner's dilemma, and also noting that there is a lot of sort of core emotion and truth in poetry that we're recognizing, which is so nice to see and hear. I just wanted to comment on, I love this idea of being able to ask our students and ourselves to embrace a different purpose in reading the poetry. So not say, or not only do I like it or do I not like it, but what can I learn from this? And I think that would be a really interesting way pedagogically to talk about critical thinking, because a lot of times with our students, they leap right to like, well, being critical is saying what's wrong with something. You're like, no. And for all of our frameworks and models and examples of the actual output we're looking for, I think we miss a trick. And I do think that poetry could be a really lovely way to say, look, I'm not being critical in this case is looking to see where you can empathize with, like, what are the links or what have you learned about this perspective and how do you know you've learned it in a way that's quite concentrated. Sam's put the link to another chat we had in the chat. And then I wanted to know, there's a lovely exercise. I don't know if people in the room would be aware. There's something called the National Writing Project in America, which is a massive, nationally huge, like wide and just enormous effort to train high school teachers of writing in what's called writing workshop. But one of the first exercises you learn to do in there is from Nancy Atwell, who's a quite famous educator in the States. And it's a poem about me. And it's a fantastic exercise. And the whole point of it is to start with this idea that you have enough, like you are enough. You have things to write about because you're you. And it just reminded me that like there's no reason that has to live in the high school setting. That kind of thing could quite easily transfer just about anywhere. So yeah.
Thanks, Jenny. And Samantha, I think that's the Billy Collins one, isn't it? Yeah, I love that Billy Collins poem that Samantha shared in the chat, because it kind of, and yeah, Billy Collins is an amazing poet anyway, but I think he is very accessible, but incredibly meta as well. Like, he talks about the craft, but in a way that's not at all nasal gazing or pretentious, but like really helps you to understand why poetry matters and what it is. So that's a great recommendation. And yeah, the link I just shared in the chat is a podcast that Jenny and I and some others recorded about using poetry in higher ed that people might also enjoy. So unless there's any other comments, we'll move on then. So basically then, yes, absolutely, Joe. So we've read some poems, we've analysed some poems. Let's write some poems, okay? We're going to do a warm-up exercise first. So we're going to write 3 very, very quick poems. So if you can get your writing instruments, you can use your computer, laptop, pen and paper, mobile phone, papyrus, whatever you want to use. And we're going to write a list poem or 3 list poems. List poems are great. Basically, I give you a prompt and you write everything that comes into your head when I say that prompt. It can be very staccato, bullet point list. It can be very Joycean, long, rambling sentences, very literal, very metaphorical, whatever you want it to be. Certainly the first 2 of these we're not going to share, so it can just be, completely safe space. And then if you feel confident, we might invite sharing on the 3rd. So I will give you the prompt. I will say start, and then I want you to keep writing until I say stop. People following along, rewatching this video, you can just do this in real time. I will talk over the top so that there's not an awkward silence. So without further ado, the first prompt, I would like you to list all the things in your room. Start. So just keep writing. So you can list all of the things that you can see, all of the things that you can hear, all of the things that you can smell, that you can taste, that you can touch, all of the people in your room, all of the memories in your room, all of the absences in your room. As I said, you can be very, very literal, or you can be slightly playful, surreal, abstract. There's no rhyme or reason to this. It's just keep writing as a stream of consciousness. You've got about 15 seconds left. So think about any colors that you can see. Think about any soundscapes that exist. Think about the mood that the room makes you feel. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. Okay, so exactly the same exercise, but just a different prompt. So list all the things out of a window. Start. If you're in a room without a window, imagine that there's a window there through one of the walls and what you can see. So again, all of the things that you can see out of the window, all of the things that you can maybe touch out of the window, though for health and safety, maybe don't do that. All the things that you can smell, that you can taste, that you can hear, people, memories, observations, the weather, the climate, flora, fauna, everything that exists. And again, you can write in very bullet pointed lists, or you can string it together into long, rambling sentences, or somewhere completely in between. Got about 10 seconds left. Just keep writing. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. Okay, great. So last prompt now, something slightly different, but exactly the same exercise. So I want you to list all the things that you associate with higher education. Start. So this can be a very cathartic exercise. You can list all the positive things, all the negative things, all the ambivalent things, all the ambiguous things. You can list all the people that you associate, all the ideas, all the places. I would challenge you, if you've been very literal up to this point, to maybe be a bit more playful. And likewise, if you've been very playful, I'd challenge you to maybe be a little bit more literal. However you want to do it, and just everything that comes into your mind when you associate with higher education. It might be your higher education, it might be somebody else's, might be your experiences as an educator, your experiences as a learner, how they overlap, opportunities, barriers, challenges, people, places. You've got 5 seconds left. 4, 3, 2, 1, and stop. Okay. If people feel comfortable, confident doing so, feel free to please just drop those in the chat, only if you want to, though. It's a completely safe space. And we'll also use this list as a kind of word bank when we come on to writing another poem later on in the session. But this is, I use this particular exercise a lot for problem solving. So if I'm thinking about a specific issue, I'll write a list poem about it, because it just gets me thinking all the stream of consciousness, everything that's down on that, and then starting to reformulate that. So Samantha writes, it's overwhelming, stacks of books towering, papers stashed, memories hoarded on shelves, sepia toned and vibrant, waiting to catch fire. That is beautiful, Samantha, in 1 minute. Very, very impressive. And again, what we were talking about earlier, this can be a really useful exercise for displaying vulnerability, for asking students to, even to touch on keystone topics in a very non-belonging sense of the thing. Like, imagine that you're teaching environmental science and you want students to talk to you about the tipping points of extinction. Like, what are they? Just getting people to think about those and get them down. This can be a very useful exercise. So I give this to you. So what I want to think about now then is reflecting. And we're going to use this reflection to then formulate some poems. So many of you will be familiar with Gibbs's model of reflection. Obviously, other models of reflection exist, Kolb, Schoen, etc. I find this model of reflection really helpful. And the reason I do is that, as much as I said at the start, as much as I try to train my brain away from it, I am a scientist. And when I first, was invited to reflect on my practice and teaching in higher ed, I realized it was very descriptive. It wasn't reflective at all. And so actually what this model really helped me for is it made me look and think, okay, actually the descriptive part of a reflection is a sixth of that process. There's so many other things that are there. So I'll give a worked example of this in a second. So, you begin by thinking about the description of what happened. Then you talk about your feelings. What were you thinking and feeling? Then an evaluation, what was good and bad about the experience. Analysis, what can you make of the situation? Conclusion, what else could you have done? An action plan, if it arose again, what would you do? Maybe one of the criticisms of this particular model is that it's quite difficult to separate the analysis and the conclusion and the action plan, but that's fine. If you end up with 4 steps instead of 6, that's not a problem at all. Models are made to, if not be broken, then to be demonstrated. I'll just quickly break this up with a poem from Marine, because this is beautiful. Of outside the window, Indian black crows with their own language, trees sway in unison as though they speak to each other. Green, green and more green, sign of life. Loud music from neighbor. Is it necessary? I would argue no, it is not necessary. So this gives us a model of reflection. I'm going to give you an example of this, and then I'm going to invite us to write our own reflections on a formative learning experience. Again, I'm going to be vulnerable here. So this is an experience that doesn't really reflect well on me, but it was a very, very formative experience for me. So this is my first ever lecture. So back when I was a lecturer in science communication at Manchester Metropolitan University, this will be 10 years ago now. So description, what happened? In my first ever lecture, I waited outside the classroom to shake hands with the cohort. One of the female students said she could not shake my hands for religious reasons. So I don't know why, but I thought that as a lecturer, you had to stand outside the lecture room and shake hands with all of your students. I don't know why I thought that, but I did. And one of my female students said that she couldn't shake my hand for religious reasons. Feelings, I felt really embarrassed, but I also was worried that I'd upset, shamed, or offended the student. Evaluation, what was good or bad? It was very bad that I'd potentially upset the student, but afterwards I privately checked in with them, and thankfully it wasn't the case. I hadn't upset them. Analysis, this was an awkward situation that forced me to reevaluate how to approach the needs of the individual and working with the students. What do I mean by that? Well, actually, rather than just thinking I'm not going to shake hands again, it made me think about my own positionality. And it made me think about the fact that I felt comfortable and I wanted to shake hands with people for whatever reason, but that was exerting my own needs, my own experiences, and my own privileges upon my students. And it really made me think very carefully about the fact that all of my students, or all of the students that I worked with, are different, and that they obviously don't have the same lived experiences and privileges as me, and that they're all individuals. So conclusion, what could I have done differently? Well, I could have checked beforehand about the potential implications of my handshaking. For example, asking colleagues if they shook the hands of all their students, to which they'd probably say, obviously not, what are you doing? And the action plan, you'll be happy to hear that I no longer lurk outside my classrooms waiting to shake the hands of my students. But more than that, I try to understand their individual needs rather than assume that they are the same as mine. So for me, using this model really helped me to reflect deeply on the issue here. So rather than just saying, I'm obviously not going to shake hands again, that was silly, it really made me think about my own privileges and positionality as a white heterosexual cisgendered male, and how my students obviously weren't the same as me, and really think about that. And it's something that I try to take into my classrooms now as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to give everyone about 10 minutes, maybe a bit less than about 8 minutes. Something will come straight into your head when you think about this, just a very formative learning or teaching experience. I want you to go through each of the steps and write down 30 to 50 words for each, and then maybe think about what step to be the most difficult. And I'm going to put the steps back on the screen now. So just go through each of these steps, 30 to 50 words for each. Again, if you end up with 4 or 5 or 6 steps, it doesn't matter. It's just about the process. I'm going to give you about 7 or 8 minutes, and I'll give you a 2 or 3 minute warning. So think about a formative learning or teaching experience, go through each of these steps, I'll turn my camera off as well, and I'll turn my mic off, and then I'll call us back in about 7 minutes, and I'll give us a 2-3 minute warning. If you don't finish, don't worry, just get as far as you can. And for people that are rewatching this video, again, just do this exercise, try and do it live, or pause and skip forward about 7 minutes time. Okay, speak to you all soon. Okay, about another 3 minutes left. Don't worry if you don't finish, but about another 3 minutes left. And thanks, Jenny, for putting the steps in the chat as well. Okay, about a minute left, about a minute left. Okay, so hopefully now we've kind of used that model to reflect and to start thinking about that formative experience. So now I want to see if we can try and turn that into a poem. And if doing so, maybe that poem will help us to reflect on it on a different way. So there's kind of a process that I've developed where we take the descriptions, feelings, and evaluation. And again, I'll give an example of this that we've just written. We write them side by side. We look for a rhythm. And that sounds very pretentious, but obviously we all know that poems don't have to rhyme, but I would argue that all poems have a rhythm. And that rhythm depends on you. It depends on what you consider rhythm to be. And I get this sounds incredibly trite, but it is true. You innately know what rhythm is, and everyone has a slightly different definition of what rhythm is, but look for a rhythm. And then filling gaps using the rest of your reflections, but also maybe some of the words or phrases from your higher education list poem. And at this point, you can change it. You don't have to use the same verbatim words that you've used in your reflection. But the most important thing is the poem true to your reflection? And, talk to the very beginning of this session about the importance of, or not, of aesthetics. And I would say that when we're writing poetry as reflection, the most important thing is to be true rather than aesthetically pleasing. So we can be both, but if there's a choice between something that feels aesthetically pleasing but is not true versus something that might be a little bit clunky but is very true to the experience, I would always recommend choosing the latter, just so that we have the confidence to stand in our own truth through the use of the poem. So let's see what that looks like. Thanks, Mia. So taking my example of take the descriptions, feelings, and evaluations and writing them side by side. In my first ever lecture, I waited outside the classroom to shake hands with the cohort. One of the female students said she could not shake my hand for religious reasons. I felt incredibly embarrassed and also worried that I had upset, shamed, or offended the student. It was very bad that I had potentially upset the student, but after checking in with them, this was thankfully not the case. Okay. Look for rhythm. So what I've done is I've just introduced some line breaks, I've just broken it up, and then I've crossed out the words that are either redundant or clunky or lack rhythm, and that leaves us with something like this. In my first ever lecture, I waited outside the classroom to shake hands. One of the students said she could not. I felt embarrassed and worried. It was very bad. So the next stage is to kind of fill in gaps, but then also to ask if the poem is true to your reflection. And these last three lines, I felt embarrassed and worried, it was very bad, just feel clunky, not really poetic, but also it puts the focus of the poem on my needs and my experiences, which is at complete odds with the reflection. So let's think about that instead. In my first lecture, I waited outside the classroom to shake hands. One of the students said she could not. I felt embarrassed for a shame we shared. Different words, but I think true to the experience. And then the last thing to do, everyone does things slightly differently, is to pick a title. Poem titles are really hard. One of my poetic mentors gave me a really good piece of advice. She said that the title should say something that the poem does not. That's not meant to be pretentious at all. But the way I interpret it is if the poem is very literal, make the title a bit more playful or metaphorical. And if the poem is very not literal, then give it a literal title to help with meaning. So the title I chose was Aligning Our Needs. So with that in mind, I would like you to have a go yourself. I'm going to give you about 8 minutes for this, 7 or 8 minutes. Take the descriptions, feelings, and evaluation, write them side by side, look for rhythm, fill in any gaps, either from your reflections or from phrases or just from words you want, and ask, is the poem true to your reflection? There'll be an opportunity to share your poem if you want to, but obviously you don't have to. This is it's a safe space. It's whatever you want to do with the poem. But yeah, just going to give you till just before the hour mark to see how you get on. So, and don't worry don't worry if you don't finish. It's just starting this process. So take the descriptions, feelings, and evaluation, write them side by side, look for your rhythm, fill in any gaps, and always ask yourself, is the poem true to your reflection? Oh, and thank you so much. I liked the title, My First Lecture. I could have left that in as well. It was quite a good title. So yes, I'll call you back in about 7 minutes time then. I'll just mute myself rather, and turn my camera off, but I am here and I'm following the chat. And thank you, Jenny, for doing such a wonderful job in facilitating that chat as well. And I'll just write into the chat what the instructions are as well, just to help everyone there as well. Okay, just going to turn my mic and video off. So about 4 minutes left. And again, a reminder, sorry, for people that are rewatching this later, just feel free to do this exercise live or to skip forward about 4 or 5 minutes from now, just to see what the results are like. And I just written these steps down in the chat as well. Thank you. So about a minute left. Don't worry if you don't finish. About a minute left. Okay, great. So everyone's written. Does anyone feel comfortable sharing what they've written? If people do feel comfortable, they can put their poem into the chat and I can read it out for you if you'd like. Or you can raise your hand virtually or physically, or just come on mic if you'd like to read it out. Obviously, if people would like to ever contribute poems to the Learned Words website, they're also very, very welcome to do so, either anonymously or not. But yeah, this is a completely safe space. So if people do feel comfortable sharing their poems, then that's great. But if not, then that's also okay. And that you've just got a poem to take away with you or to continue working on as well. Great. So I'll read Jenny's then, if that's okay. Not as planned. The one thing they tell you the first time you teach is have a plan, know what will happen. I reached up and pulled down the screen. It fell on my head, knocking plans and me sideways. Trying very hard not to laugh at that, Jenny, because I can literally imagine you in that situation. But that's beautifully coordinated and communicated there. Thank you. Oh, it was funny. Okay, good. Thank you. That's a great example and something that I'm sure we've all experienced, if not physically, then with tech issues, etc. as well. So moving on then, less lighthearted. Okay. Thank you, Samantha. Or Sam, I'll read yours. Leaving was like a divorce where I didn't get custody of the kids. Weekend visitation and starting over, looking in the mirror at a stranger until she became familiar again. That's very powerful and very moving, Samantha, and very brave and vulnerable of you to share that as well. So thank you very much. And hopefully you can see that this is a really an easy exercise, an accessible exercise. I would really recommend you using it with your students and your learners and your colleagues. I think it's important to create a safe space when you're doing this, and also, from my own experiences, just to create a platform where people can share if they want to, and they don't have to if they don't want to either. But thank you very much for participating in that particular exercise. So just a few things then to mention. I've already shared one paper in the chat. Here's a link to another one, and I've also put that in the chat as well. This is a paper that my colleague Marita Grimwood and myself wrote, which is basically looking at how we can use poetry as a way to explore staff belonging in higher education. So basically we invited people to write poetry about their experiences, some of which are on the Learned Words website, and then we did like an analysis of those poems, basically looked for any emergent narratives or themes. And yeah, it was really interesting, and you can read it there. And then even more info, I would invite you to read this book that was published last month by Professor Kirsten Jack and myself, which is on poetry and pedagogy in higher education. It's available at Policy Press. I'll also drop the link into the chat. You can get a 25% discount if you just sign up for their mailing list as well, which is really good. And as well as Professor Nicola Dandridge saying very kind things about the book. So has Jenny Blake, but I don't want to embarrass her. You can just go onto the website and see that. And again, if you enjoyed this session, then there's lots in that book, which I've got here, which I'm genuinely not trying to plug my work. It's quite a good collection of work with very practical exercises as well. Plus, if you own a handbag or a man bag, it fits really nicely into it. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover in this session. I'll stop sharing my screen. Happy to have, oh, thank you, Jenny. Had your coffee as well. So such a kind friend and ally. Here, like, if people have got any comments or questions, happy to take them. But I just wanted to say thank you very much, everyone, for being present, for being engaged, for being vulnerable, and for giving up over an hour of your Friday as well. And I should tell you that my secret learning outcome for this and any other session I do is that I hope that you feel a little bit more encouraged to welcome poetry into your lives as a result of this. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just say, yeah, thank you for being here, and happy to have any questions, comments, or discussions that people might like. And thank you very much to Jenny for doing such a wonderful job of facilitating the chat as well. Joe, I cannot say fairer than that. Thank you very much.
Sam, if you had to pick a place to start, so if someone came to this or listened to this video later and was like, okay, I want to do that, and then they're like, what exactly do I want to do? If you had to pick a place to start with poetry and pedagogy, what would it be for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess it's different for everyone, right? But for me, it would be about finding a poem or inviting our students to find a poem that speaks for them. So, like, as I said at the start, a lot of the work I do is around diversity and platforming the voices of marginalized communities. And unfortunately, poetry can be a bit difficult sometimes because a lot of people, certainly in the West, the poetry that they encounter is written by dead white dudes from the 1600s who wrote some pretty cool poetry, right? But it doesn't speak for everyone. And I think one of the really powerful ways of inviting people to welcome poetry into their lives and into their classroom and into their learning is to encourage them to find poetry that does speak to them and for them. So a really cool formative assessment, just any way of introducing a topic is to say to everyone in the class, look, I want you to go away and pick a poem that speaks to you and for you. And then, I mean, if you want to, it can be tied to the subject matter. You know, if you're teaching ancient history, you could say, go and find a poem that talks about ancient history and speaks for you. But it can just be a way of introducing yourself to your cohort and to your class. And, you know, we don't always get to do that. Especially, it works really well in personal development sessions or like tutor sessions. So yeah, I would really recommend that. And yourself going away and picking a poem and bringing that to the class and talking about why you love it. And in the podcast that I shared, you know, Jenny, we did this and Jenny picked a poem that she shared. And it's cool because if you've got a class of 30, 50 students, that's 30 or 50 new poems that you've brought into your life as well. And, you know, in the interest of honesty and transparency, I will share with you my favorite poem, which doesn't ever really change. You can go away and read this in your own time, but it's The Colonel by Caroline Forche. It's, I know, just thinking about it, it gives me goosebumps. So yeah, I would, it's a really good question, Jenny, but I would say that's a great place to start. Just inviting each of your students to go away and pick a poem that speaks for them. And even if it's not related to the subject, I think it encourages all the students to go and just find that. And if they need help and guidance, that's cool as well. You know, you can use like a VLE, like Moodle or whatever, to I use Poetry Foundation because you can find a poem that speaks for you on Poetry Foundation. There's loads of different language poems, obviously different culture poems, stretching back to the 1600s to the present day. So yeah, I would recommend that as something, as a way for people to get started with using poetry in the classrooms or learning environments.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you to everyone who's attended.